As the book recognized, evaluating teaching is complex, and it's best accomplished when we can bring in multiple sources of information. So this model is actually something Texas Tech has started to adopt, and I'll come back to this a little bit later. But I wanted to pick up on this idea of documenting your effectiveness by using multiple sources of information. In research terminology, we would call this triangulation, where you have multiple points of data that help you paint a better picture of the phenomenon or the situation you're studying. So in this case, we've already talked a bit about student evaluations of teaching. So we're going to move on and talk about peer evaluations and self-reflection. So peer evaluation of teaching is a great way to get others to see what you're doing in your classroom and for you to learn from those in your own discipline or perhaps across campus. We are accustomed in higher education to sending our research out for peer review, but very rarely do we invite people into our classroom to see what that looks like and give us input. So this is where peer evaluation of teaching steps in and tries to recognize that, peers have expertise. If it's someone within your discipline, they might comment on books or resources that you're using. They might be able to fine-tune the way you're explaining a concept or an activity that you've designed. They have the teaching experience and perspective to inform you within your discipline or within the practice of teaching in higher education. These are often completed. You complete it because it's a required component for tenure and promotion. Or continuing appointment. So you need to do it in order to keep your job. But I think one of the benefits is gaining a new perspective on your own teaching approach and style. And I have a typo, I'll fix this. It says use the insights gained to make instructional strategies. So that is where you would, apply what you've learned. I once observed someone who taught dance. And it was fascinating because I could not give her any advice about how to teach, that dance movement choreography that day. But what I took away from it was how she was engaging with students, giving directions, clarifying, misinformation or areas students misunderstood. And then, using that to continue to keep them motivated in the class. So the drawbacks of this is that it does take time to implement. So there's internal politics about who should be observing and when do you have time to go in, and sometimes people just don't feel confident in being able to walk in and tell someone else how to be a better teacher. So there are some best practices that you can use for peer evaluation of teaching. One is to have some specific criteria. So what are the things that you want to notice? And ideally, you're focusing on behavioral things, so things that they're doing or saying rather, and you can document that. Like you're not allowing enough time for them to process the question and give feedback before you move on. That's an easy piece of advice and could be adjusted. Rather than subjective. So subjective sometimes feels like judgment calls, like you're not listening enough, or you're not anticipating student questions. So there's better ways to phrase that. When you do peer evaluation of teaching, I find it's very beneficial to meet with the instructor before you observe. I find people are actually a little nervous about having someone else sit through their class, especially if it's in their discipline. So you might want to learn a little bit more about how they like to teach, what are their methods that they seem to emphasize, what is it about the course. I usually ask, what are students doing right before this? Like, what is the lesson building upon? Are there any concerns you have, or is there anything you specifically want me to focus on? You should agree when to observe. It shouldn't be a surprise. And they should tell students about why you're there so that the students aren't, concerned. I once observed a junior faculty member and I was taking notes, and I think she had said this is why Dr. Myers is in the room. But I had two students who were sitting near me after the class come up and tell me what a great teacher she was, and they loved her class, and I think they were trying to protect her, like I was there to criticize her teaching or something. But it was reassuring that she's doing a good job, and the students wanted me to know that. As much as possible, don't participate in the classroom. Man, sometimes that's hard when you're really engaged and you like the way they're teaching, but you're not there to be a student. You're there to be an observer. Finally, be respectful with the information you gather. So there might be some things that you need to rephrase how you're saying it in when you give that feedback. But also, do they just need to have that? Don't gossip or say things about them if there's a really big concern. I would, just determine how to share the information you gather and with whom, and just be respectful through that process. This website will be linked on Canvas, and I've done some work in this area on conducting peer teaching observations, and it walks through these steps and gives more advice about approaching this and conducting a peer teaching observation. So the final piece of information you could gather to add to your teaching effectiveness evidence is a self-reflection and self-assessment. So Dr. Jason Hedrick in our department actually has a resource, and this will be linked again on Canvas. But these are the questions he asked himself at the end of the semester. And these I think are really important questions to ask. And as you're teaching a course, whether it's for the first time or the 10th time, you can be asking your questions so that way you're making notes about what to improve and what to change. Also, what went well and celebrating those victories. And to me, this really builds in and highlights some of the hidden work that goes into teaching well, like having to create new lecture materials, write new tests or exams, finding relevant readings, designing active learning exercises, and so on. I just want to give you a sneak peek here at Texas Tech, within our faculty reporting system that I have to complete each year for my annual performance review, there are areas for me to add this self-reflection. So for each class I teach, I can answer these questions and provide as much or as little detail. And I found this was really helpful during times that I've taught a new class or I've redesigned a course to document that process, because it's usually a little heavier lift at that point. So this page, this shows all those questions that I would respond to in a self-reflection, just to give you a little more insight into that process. So another way that you can, do this self-reflection more holistically, it's not just in one class, but how you view yourself as a teacher, is to write a teaching philosophy. So these teaching philosophies are typically 1 to 2 single-space pages, and they're written more as an essay and in first person. So you're talking about yourself, and you're writing it in a more engaging manner than a research paper might be. It's often required as a part of a job application, particularly for positions that have a high teaching appointment. And it should demonstrate how you are reflecting on teaching and what strategies you find most effective. So it incorporates both cognitive and affective elements. So the more specific methodologies, and then affective is more what you hope students learn from you through those activities. So it explains your theory of how learning occurs and how you work to foster it. I've seen many that have value statements or goals that motivate them to teach. And again, you can list specific teaching methods or theories that you align with. So you are going to work on this for this semester, And this is just an overview of that teaching philosophy assignment. The full assignment description is on Canvas. And, as you're considering this, really reflect on your teaching values. Why do you teach? What do you hope students learn from your course or courses? How would you define effective teaching and learning? And I'm not going to read through all these questions, but they are available in the assignment description. So reflect on these and write down some ideas and start to work that into a narrative that concisely describes your teaching philosophy. I have on the assignment sheet that this should be 2 pages double spaced, and what I want you to think about is that it's at least 2 pages double spaced, but no more than 4. So we'll keep it more concise, but more in line with that 1 to 2 page single spaced. But for my purposes, it's a little easier to read it when it's double spaced initially. There are some resources, and again, I'll put these links on Canvas that you can use to help discover your teaching philosophy. So there's a teaching goals inventory. There's also the teaching perspectives inventory. What I would say is try to answer these questions first, and then if you're stumped and you really want some more insight, go to this, because the questions you have to answer here require that you've thought about it a little bit first. This link that I'll have again on Canvas has many examples of teaching philosophies, so you can review some for inspiration. The teaching portfolio is another way to pull all of these things together and showcase your teaching effectiveness. So it's a collection of materials. There's not a single format. It can include many things. I think the closest I've been to doing a true teaching portfolio would be when I've applied for major teaching awards or putting together my dossier for promotion and tenure. So there's a number of things that you would include, such as an opening statement, and then you can annotate the content. Again, this varies widely by what institutions are requiring. So the book has some more examples, and I would say it just depends, and you would need to follow the guidelines of the institution asking for the portfolio. So the final thing about documenting effectiveness is to try to actually report on student learning, because at the end of the day, teaching effectiveness should be directly correlated with learning. And the book highlights a couple ways to measure student learning, whether it's through indirect measures, such as the student assessment of their learning gains, or pre and post-test direct measures. So you could give students the final exam at the beginning of the semester and see how they do, and then give it to them at the end and compare the scores. I thought that was an intriguing idea, and you have to be careful not to let the test questions get out and float around or change them just enough to avoid cheating, but it would give you a very direct measure of how students are learning. I tell my students in my writing intensive class that no matter what, I want them to leave the class as a better writer than when they started. And that's an individual process. So I can look at some things to track that, but I'm starting to consider maybe there are better ways to document that learning effect, the teaching effectiveness. The final one here is this teaching practices inventory. And this is a way for you to look at what you're implementing, and are you doing a good job of implementing these best practices? So we're going to stop there, and then in the next video, I'm going to talk about the efforts at Texas Tech University to improve our teaching evaluation process.